Good evening, my name is Abby Francisco, and this is my presentation for CAP1 ATP Pathways. Now to start, we'll go over ATP production from one molecule of glucose, and we'll take that one molecule of glucose right here, and what it'll do is go through glycolysis. And in this process, the products are 2 pyruvates, 1,2, and it also produces a net of 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Now we'll take 1 pyruvate, and if oxygen is present, pyruvate goes through pyruvate oxidation right here, in which 1 NADH is produced from NAD, as well as 1 acetyl coenzyme A. Now from there, and this is important, acetyl coenzyme A combines with oxaloacetic acid to create citric acid, and we'll circle back to that at the end, but that combination is important, and from there we can continue on to the Krebs cycle. As the Krebs cycle proceeds or continues, 3 NADHs are produced, 1 GTP, and 1 FADH2. And so the NADHs all here produced, and the FADH2 will go through the electron transport train, will then be oxidized and ATP produced. Now ATP production from fat is quite different. To begin, we'll start with the fatty acid, in this case palidic acid, and in order for that to be activated, 2 ATPs must be released in order to create acyl-CoA. Now, once this fatty acid converts to acyl-CoA, it will go through a series of processes cumulatively called beta oxidation. Now, the first stage of beta oxidation is dehydrogenation right here, where FADH2 is a product and trans-acyl-CoA is produced. The second stage is hydration, where a hydration molecule is actually added, and hydroxyl acyl-CoA is produced. And then in the third stage, we go through hydrogenation again, and NADH is produced, and ketoacyl-CoA is a product as well. Now from there, it splits into myristyl-CoA and acetyl coenzyme A, like back in the Krebs cycle. Now, beta oxidation will go through about 7 cycles. And at the end of the 7th cycle, these are the products. So there should be 8 acetyl coenzyme A, and 7 NADH, and 7 FADH2. The 8 acetyl coenzyme A will bind to oxaloacetic acid, like what I described prior in the ATP production from a molecule of glucose. And from there, it will continue on to the Krebs cycle. And these two here, the 7 NADH and the 7 FADH2, will proceed on to the electron transport chain, where they will be oxidized to produce ATP. Now here we have the total ATP yield from both pathways. From glucose, we'll have the 2 ATPs from glycolysis, and then the 10 NADH, the 2 FADH2, and 2 GTP, all from the Krebs cycle. So right here we have the ATP key I added here, where it says the NADH is 2.5 ATP and so on and so forth. So doing that math, the total ATP yield from glucose is 32 ATP. Now from fat, what we just went over, the products of that are 8 acetyl coenzyme A, which is quite large in its ATP production, yielding 80 ATP at the end of the A cycle. And then remember that we started off with that activation of the fatty acid. So then after the 7 cycles of 7 NADH, we have 17.5 ATP, and 7 FADH2 yielding 10.5 ATP. And then at the beginning of the fat pathway, we did need that 2 ATP in order to activate the fatty acid. So at the end of the pathway from fat, we do have 106 ATP, which is quite significant from glucose. Now next we have the interaction across exercise and intensity and duration. Now there is a difference between using glucose and utilizing fat as a source for ATP. On the glucose side, it is crucial for short maximal effort exercise lasting 90 seconds or less. It can be used aerobically or anaerobically, so with or without oxygen. And when used with oxygen or aerobically, it supplies fuels for long durations. And when used without oxygen, lactic acid is a byproduct. So the reason that we're able to use glucose without oxygen is because of that glycolysis. And if oxygen is present, they'll go to the Krebs cycle. Now from fat, it's the main fuel source for aerobic exercise. It does take a little bit longer time to produce ATP than other ATP sources like glucose. Additionally, it becomes the primary fuel source when intense long duration exercise depletes blood glucose and muscle glycogen, like in distance running. So because it does take a longer time to produce ATP compared to glucose, it is better used for long duration exercise. Now there are some limitations, like in most things, to ATP production for both glucose and fat. For glucose, I think that the ATP and NADH are some limiting factors, as they are too much presence of ATP or NADH acts as enzyme inhibitors. And when enzymes are inhibited, this slows down the rate of ATP production. Additionally, glycolysis is also a limiting factor for glucose as ATP production. Glycolysis is limited by enzymes, fructose 1, and oxygen. So actually, if there is an abundance of oxygen, this will inhibit glycolysis and therefore inhibiting ATP production. For fat, the main limiting factor here is that ATP production from fat is very dependent on carbohydrate breakdown. So before, when I said that this is really important, we're going to circle back to it at the end. It referred to oxaloacetate or oxaloacetic acid. So in this case, when there are lower levels of pyruvate, there are decreased levels of oxaloacetate and malate. And oxaloacetate was important because the acetyl coenzyme A will combine with that acid and then go, and that's needed in order to go to or continue on to the Krebs cycle, producing ATP. So that brings us to here, oxaloacetate, because if that isn't available for acetyl coenzyme A to bind to, then the Krebs cycle won't happen, and therefore ATP won't be produced. So to conclude, whether you choose to use glucose or fat as a fuel source really depends on the type of activity being performed, as well as the intensity level. So the greatest yield, which would be fat in this case, is not always the most ideal choice when considering type of exercise, your fitness goals, and your body composition. So these long duration activities, ATP from fat is more beneficial as it's better for longer duration, and conversely, ATP from glucose is more beneficial for that power and short duration exercise or activity, as it is available right away, right when you need it. And the ATP from fat takes a little bit more time. Again, the type of exercise and your fitness goals really matter here. Body composition matters as well. If you're doing a lot of, aesthetic, or if you need a lower body composition or minimal fat, you're not going to want to use a lot of fat as your resource. And if you're doing a lot of power drills and you need that short available energy, you're going to want to use the glucose. So really, it just depends on what you're doing and what your goals are. And that concludes my presentation for ATP Pathways. Thank you.